The night before the rope, the jailhouse breathed like a living thing, wood creaking softly as the wind slid through the cracks and brushed the gallows outside, and Elias Crow sat alone on the narrow cot with his wrists free for the first time in years, a small mercy granted by a tired sheriff who believed even monsters deserved a final hour without iron, and as the lantern flickered, throwing shadows that climbed the stone walls like reaching hands, Elias closed his eyes and listened to the sound he had tried to outrun his whole life, the wind whispering his name as if the land itself remembered him not as a legend, not as a killer, but as a boy born under a sky too wide for mercy. And he began to speak, not loudly, not for anyone else, but because silence had finally become heavier than truth, and he said that the stories were wrong, all of them, every blood-soaked tale passed from saloon to saloon, because before he was the man they cursed, he had been a son who learned early that love could vanish faster than smoke, that promises broke easier than bones, and that night by night, he had learned to carve himself hollow just to survive, and he confessed that the first man he ever killed had not been a lawman or a gambler but his own father, not in rage but in terror, when the drunken fists came down again and again and his mother's breath failed beneath them, and the gun had gone off by accident, or fate, or maybe mercy, and when Elias opened his eyes again his father was dead and the boy he had been died with him, and the town did not ask why, they only asked who, and so he ran, carrying guilt like a second spine, shaping his face into something hard enough to frighten the world before it could frighten him again, and he told how he learned to steal not because he wanted gold but because hunger teaches its own lessons, how he learned to shoot not because he loved violence but because hesitation gets you buried, and how each body added to his name made the legend louder and the truth quieter, until even he forgot which parts of himself were real, and the wind outside rattled the noose as if impatient, but Elias continued, his voice steady now, almost gentle, as he spoke of the one thing the legend never mentioned, the woman whose name he had never said aloud since the night he lost her, Clara Bell, a schoolteacher with dust on her hem and fire in her eyes, who looked at him once like she saw the boy beneath the scars, and how for a season he let himself believe that redemption was not a fairy tale told to children, that a man could lay his gun down and still wake up breathing, and he confessed how he tried, truly tried, leaving money on doorsteps, riding past trouble instead of toward it, dreaming of a small house and mornings without blood on his hands, until the law came anyway, because the past never forgets, and Clara was taken by men who wanted his head more than justice, and when Elias found her she was alive but broken, her hands shaking, her eyes hollowed by fear that never left, and that night he became the monster the stories love, because he did not kill for survival or hunger or fear, he killed for love twisted into rage, and every man who had touched her paid in ways that followed Elias into his sleep, and when Clara begged him to run, to let it end, he knew he could not, because some sins do not wash clean, they only sink deeper, and he left her with tears he pretended not to see, believing distance would save her, though it doomed him, and the legend grew until it swallowed everything else, until children played games pretending to be him and mothers used his name to frighten them into bed, and now here he was, hours from death, confessing to walls and shadows, admitting that every robbery he staged after that was meant to draw attention away from Clara's new life, that every chase was a deliberate trail meant to pull danger toward himself and away from the only good thing he had ever known. And he laughed softly at the irony, because history would remember him as a devil when he had spent his final years acting as a shield, and he admitted he was tired, so very tired, of carrying a story that was never his to tell, and as the lantern dimmed, Elias Crow spoke of regret not as pain but as longing, the longing to be seen once without fear, to be remembered once without hate, to have someone know that beneath the outlaw's name was a man who loved too deeply and learned too late that the Wild West had no room for gentle hearts, and when footsteps echoed outside, he did not stop speaking. Because the confession was no longer for forgiveness but for release, and he said that when the sun rose and the rope tightened, the crowd would cheer, and the land would seem cleaner for it, but the truth would ride on the wind long after his body stilled, whispering that monsters are often made, not born, and that sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one people want to believe, and as the door creaked open and the sheriff's shadow stretched across the floor, Elias finished with a breath that felt lighter than any he had taken in years, saying that death did not scare him, only being forgotten wrongly did, and as the gallows groaned outside, waiting, the outlaw sat straighter, eyes clear, ready at last to let the truth die with him, or live beyond him, depending on who was willing to listen. They said her name only when the wind was loud enough to hide fear, whispered it in saloons where cards stuck to sweaty palms and glasses trembled with lies, because Elena Roses carried a reputation heavier than grief, and when she arrived in red mesa riding a dust-worn horse at the edge of sunset, dressed in black not for show but for memory, the town seemed to lean away from her as if fate itself walked at her side, and no one asked where she came from or why her eyes looked older than her years, for stories had traveled ahead of her like omens, stories of men who loved her and died with her name on their lips, outlaws mostly, gunslingers chased by law or ghosts or both, each meeting a violent end not long after giving her their heart, and though no proof tied her hands to their deaths, coincidence became curse in a land where fear needed no evidence, and so Elena bought a small adobe house at the edge of town where the desert stretched wide and merciless, planted white sage by the door for reasons she never explained, and lived quietly, making a living sewing and tending a small garden that survived only because she spoke to the soil like it could hear her sorrow. And at night she lit one lamp and sat alone, touching the silver ring she still wore though the man it belonged to lay beneath a wooden cross somewhere beyond memory, and she told herself she was done with love, done with longing, done with the dangerous hope that bloomed too easily in lonely hearts, yet fate, cruel and patient, had not finished with her, because one evening as the sun bled red across the mesa and the air shimmered with heat, a man collapsed at her doorstep, boots dragging weak lines through the dust, blood darkening his shirt where a bullet had torn too close to the heart, and Elena found him there when she opened her door, a stranger with sunburned skin, revolver slipping from his hand, eyes struggling to stay open, and she stood frozen for a moment, knowing the shape of this moment too well, knowing how many times a wounded man had crossed her path like a prophecy repeating itself, and every sensible part of her screamed to turn away, to let the town deal with him, to refuse the role fate always handed her, but she knelt anyway, because mercy had never learned to obey fear, and she dragged him inside with strength born from necessity, pressing cloth to his wound, whispering calm words though she did not know if he could hear them, and as she worked, she noticed he did not look like the others, not wild-eyed or reckless, but tired, deeply tired, like a man who had been running not toward danger but away from it, and when he woke days later, fever broken and breath steady, he found Elena seated nearby, sewing quietly, her face calm but guarded, and he introduced himself as Jonah Pike, a gunslinger by skill but not by choice, a man who had learned early that the gun was sometimes the only language the world respected, and he thanked her with a softness that surprised them both, and from that moment, something fragile and dangerous began to grow, not rushed or dramatic but slow and reluctant, built from shared silences and careful conversations, Jonah staying because he was too weak to leave at first and then because he found peace in her presence, Elena allowing it because despite her fear she felt seen without being chased, and as weeks passed, the town watched from a distance, waiting for the pattern to repeat, counting the days as if death were a schedule that never failed, and Elena felt the weight of their eyes whenever she walked to market, heard the warnings spoken half kindly and half accusingly, yet Jonah refused to leave, even when he learned her name and the stories attached to it, even when she told him the truth. One night under a sky burning with stars, how every man she loved had died, how she believed herself cursed, how she had buried hope alongside her husbands and lovers, and Jonah listened without flinching, holding her trembling hands, telling her quietly that death followed many men in the West, that perhaps she was not the cause but the witness, the one left alive to remember, and though his words soothed her, fear still slept between them, a third presence in the room, because love, once awakened, brings with it the terror of loss, and sure enough, trouble came, as it always did, in the form of men who recognized Jonah Pike as the gunslinger who had crossed the wrong outlaw gang months earlier, men who believed blood debts did not fade with time, and when they rode into Red Mesa kicking up dust and asking questions, the town grew tense, glances sliding toward Elena's house like accusations, and Jonah knew then that staying meant dragging danger to her door, the very thing he swore not to do, and so he planned to leave before dawn, packing quietly, touching the walls as if memorizing them, but Elena woke and found him there, and the argument that followed was not loud but devastating, filled with truth neither wanted to hear, Jonah insisting she deserved peace, Elena begging him not to decide her fate without her, both knowing the shadow at their backs was already too close, and when gunfire shattered the morning anyway, fate proved its cruelty once more, the outlaws arriving sooner than expected, forcing Jonah into the street while Elena watched from the doorway, heartbreaking with every step he took away from her, the town frozen in fear as bullets rang out beneath the burning sun, and Jonah fought not like a legend but like a man desperate to live, desperate to return, yet the West rarely grants such mercy, and when the smoke cleared, he lay wounded again, worse than before, blood staining the dust just steps from Elena's reach, and she ran to him despite the danger, kneeling as she had before, hands shaking, tears falling onto his face as he smiled weakly and told her she had changed everything, that loving her had made his life mean something beyond survival. And as he faded, Elena felt the familiar horror closing in, the certainty that the stories were right, that she was doomed wearing a human face. And when Jonah's breathing finally stilled, the town looked away, shame mixing with relief, because the pattern had completed itself. Once more, and Elena buried him herself beyond the mesa where the desert met the sky, placing a stone at his head and sage at his feet, whispering goodbye to a love that had burned bright and brief like all the others. And yet, as she returned home alone, something inside her shifted, because for the first time, she did not feel cursed, only human, grieving not because fate demanded it but because love had been real. And as the sun set red over red mesa, the widow closed her door, unaware that her story was not ending but turning, that somewhere beyond the horizon, consequences were already moving, and that the dangerous thread fate had woven between her heart and the Wild West was far from finished. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like, forgotten the sound of boots walking with purpose instead of fear, forgotten the weight of a badge meant to protect instead of provoke. And so when a lone rider came in from the west one late afternoon, coat frayed, horse limping, silver star pinned crooked to his chest like a thing he had tried and failed to bury, the town watched from behind curtains and cracked doors, because only a fool or a ghost would claim authority in a place ruled for years by guns and men who answered only to themselves. And the rider was a little of both, Marshal Thomas Hale, a man with lines carved deep into his face by regret rather than age, who dismounted slowly in the center of the street as if every movement reminded him of something lost. And he did not announce himself or call for order. He only stood there while the wind pushed dust around his boots and the past pressed heavier than the revolver at his side, because this was the town where everything had gone wrong, the place he had sworn never to return after the night he failed, the night the screams drowned out his commands and the law died with the people he loved. And now Deadwood Crossing stared back at him like an old wound reopened, daring him to try again, and Thomas felt the familiar pull to turn away, to keep riding until memory loosened its grip. But he had come because there was nowhere else left to go, because a badge once earned does not stop weighing on a man's soul just because he wishes it would. And within minutes the men who truly ran the town made themselves known, led by Cole Branner, a broad-shouldered brute with cold eyes and a smile built from broken teeth, who laughed openly at the sight of a marshal with tired hands and a past everyone remembered. And Cole's laughter carried the message clearly, leave or be buried. And Thomas met his gaze without flinching, not because he felt brave but because fear had already taken everything it could from him years ago. And so he walked into the empty sheriff's office, swept out dust and spiderwebs, and sat behind a desk scarred by old bullet holes, pinning his badge properly this time, knowing the town would test him before sunset. And they did, first with threats muttered in alleys, then with shots fired near enough to remind him how close death still lived. And as the day wore on, people began to speak to him quietly, not with trust but with desperation. Mothers whose sons had been taken by gangs, shopkeepers bled dry by protection money, men who once believed in law but had learned survival instead. And each story added weight to Thomas's shoulders, because he knew how this ended if he failed again. And when night came, so did the ghosts, filling the office with memories he could not keep out, the face of his wife, Anna, smiling before the gunfire, the sound of his partner's voice shouting orders that came too late, the smell of smoke and blood that never truly left his senses. And he confessed to the empty room that he had run after that night not because he stopped believing in justice but because he believed he was the flaw that broke it, that his hesitation, his hope for peaceful endings, had cost lives. And as he sat there with his head in his hands, he understood that Deadwood Crossing was not testing his strength but his resolve to fail and still stand up again. And dawn came with bad news, riders spotted on the ridge, Branner's men gathering, guns and numbers enough to erase what little order remained, and the town buzzed with panic, some packing to flee, others readying for a fight they did not believe they could win. And Thomas knew this was the moment that would define him forever, because he could leave now, save his life, preserve the idea that one man could not fix a broken place, or he could stay and risk repeating history. And he chose to stay, not out of heroism but because redemption, he had learned, is not about success, it is about refusal to abandon what matters. And so he walked the streets, spoke plainly, organized defenses where he could, placed people where they might survive instead of where they might win. And when the first shots rang out under the harsh sun, Deadwood Crossing became a battlefield, dust and gunfire choking the air, fear screaming louder than commands. And Thomas moved through it with grim focus, not fearless but steady, dragging the wounded to cover, firing only when he had to, shouting instructions that finally found ears willing to listen, and in the chaos, he saw Cole Branner across the street, directing violence like a conductor, and Thomas knew this had always been between them, law and the refusal to be ruled, and when they faced each other, guns raised, time seemed to slow, Thomas remembering the last time he stood like this and failed to pull the trigger soon enough, and this time he did not hesitate, firing not in anger but in grim necessity, and when Branner fell, the fight did not end immediately but its heart was cut out, and as the smoke cleared and the remaining men fled, Deadwood Crossing stood battered but breathing, and Thomas Hale leaned against a wall, blooded, exhausted, alive, and the town looked at him differently now, not as a savior but as a man who stayed, who did not run when the past tried to claim him again, and as night fell, Thomas sat on the office steps, badge warm against his chest, knowing the war was not truly over, knowing consequences always follow gunfire, but for the first time in years, the ghosts were quieter, and though he did not know what tomorrow would bring, he knew this much, Deadwood Crossing had law again, and whether it survived or not, he would face what came next without turning away. Black Canyon cut through the earth like a wound that never healed, its jagged wall swallowing sunlight and sound alike, and long before men ever chased gold into its depths, the elders said the place was wrong, that shadows moved there without bodies and the wind spoke in voices not meant for human ears, yet legends have never stopped desperate men. And so when Samuel Ridgway found the map folded inside a dead prospector's coat in a half-burned shack outside Yuma, his first feeling was not fear but relief, because hunger and failure had stripped him of everything else, and the map promised salvation in ink so faded it looked like it had been written in blood, marking a vein of gold deep within Black Canyon, with a single warning scrawled beneath it in trembling script, "Take only what you are willing to pay for," and Samuel laughed when he read it, the dry, bitter laugh of a man who had already paid dearly just to stay alive, losing his wife to sickness, his child to the earth, his farm to drought, until gold seemed less like greed and more like the last argument he had left with fate, and so he followed the map across scorched desert days and freezing nights, the canyon rising before him like a mouth waiting to be fed, and it was there, at the edge, that he first heard the whisper, a low murmur curling around his thoughts like smoke, calling his name though no one stood nearby, promising rest, warmth, purpose, and when he spun around, heart racing, there was only stone and shadow, and though fear tried to take hold, Samuel told himself it was hunger, exhaustion, the tricks of a mind stretched thin, yet the whispers followed him down into the canyon, growing clearer with every step, guiding him unerringly along paths the map barely hinted at, until he reached a narrow cleft where the rock shimmered faintly even in near darkness, veins of gold catching what little light reached that deep, and at the sight, Samuel fell to his knees, sobbing not from joy but from release, because after years of loss, the world had finally given something back, and as he chipped away at the rock with shaking hands, the voices grew warmer, kinder, telling him he deserved this, that suffering earned reward, that the gold was his by right, and he worked for hours, filling his pack until it strained at the seams. Ignoring the ache in his bones, ignoring the way the air seemed to thicken with every strike, and when he finally stopped to rest, he noticed something wrong, something he had tried not to see. The gold veins did not end where he mined them, they pulsed, faintly, like living things, and the whispers shifted, no longer comforting but insistent, asking him to take more, reminding him of debts unpaid, of graves unattended, of promises broken by death and time, and when Samuel covered his ears, the voices moved inside him instead, filling his head with images of his wife smiling again, his child running through fields that no longer existed, and they told him he could have it all back, not metaphorically but truly, if he stayed, if he dug deeper, if he fed the canyon what it hungered for, and terror finally rooted him in place, because he understood then that the gold was bait, that the canyon did not curse men for taking gold but for believing it came without cost, and as he stumbled back toward daylight, pack heavy with treasure, the canyon resisted him, paths twisting, shadows closing in, the whispers turning sharp, accusing him of betrayal, reminding him of every selfish thought he had ever had, every moment he chose survival over kindness, and when he finally burst into the sun, gasping, Samuel did not stop running until the canyon lay far behind him, and for a time, he believed he had escaped, because the whispers faded to memory and the gold bought him food, shelter, even comfort, yet peace never came, because at night he dreamed of the canyon breathing, of veins of gold wrapping around his limbs, of voices asking calmly for payment, and soon misfortune began to follow him like a shadow, horses breaking legs, tools snapping in his hands, people falling ill after accepting his gold, and Samuel noticed how those coins seemed colder than others, how they rang wrong when dropped, and guilt gnawed at him until he tried to give it all away, tossing gold into rivers, leaving bags outside churches, burying it in the desert. But the whispers returned stronger each time, angry now, telling him the debt was not measured in metal but in flesh and memory. And when a man Samuel had paid with canyon gold died suddenly, eyes wide with terror, Samuel understood at last that the curse did not stay in Black Canyon, it traveled with those who took from it, spreading suffering outward like ripples. And with that knowledge came resolve, because desperation had led him there, but choice would decide how it ended. And so Samuel returned to Black Canyon one final time, older, thinner, haunted, carrying with him every last piece of gold he could recover. And the canyon welcomed him like an old friend, whispers soft and pleased, promising forgiveness, promising release if he only stepped back inside. And this time, Samuel listened fully, not to the promises but to the hunger beneath them. And he realized the canyon was not evil in the way men understood it. It was empty, endlessly empty, feeding on longing itself. And standing at the edge, Samuel Ridgway made the only bargain left to him, throwing the gold back into the depths piece by piece, feeling the weight lift from his soul with every clatter of metal on stone. And as the last coin vanished into shadow, the whispers screamed, not in rage but in loss, and the canyon shook as if wounded, collapsing parts of itself, sealing the vein forever beneath tons of rock. And when silence finally fell, it was absolute, and Samuel walked away with nothing but his life, poorer than ever yet lighter than he had been in years. And though history would later tell of the devil's gold of Black Canyon, of men who vanished chasing it and of maps that led nowhere, no one would ever know the full truth, that the greatest price the canyon demanded was not blood or soul but the willingness to let go of the lie that wealth can heal grief. And Samuel Ridgway spent the rest of his days warning others in quiet ways, steering them from the canyon with stories that sounded like superstition, knowing most would not listen, because desperation has always been louder than wisdom. And somewhere deep beneath the stone, the gold waited still, silent now, not gone but patient, because the West, like the devil himself, never truly runs out of men willing to believe they can take without paying.